So over this last year, the rain has fallen a lot. It's more than it has over the last 10 years. And there's a waterfall up the mountain a bit, and that's been flowing 3 or 4 times already, which is far more than usual. And when I was a younger monk, I would sometimes climb up the mountain to the waterfall. But now, in my old age, I'm not able to take the cold anymore. So even though there's no river up the top of the mountain, still the water flows. And it's because when the rain falls, it gets stored in the ground. And then that flows down through the earth. And it allows for these waterfalls to happen. And so the rain comes and it goes into the ground, and that's what provides us with our water here as well. And it flows all the way to the village as well. And the villagers have mentioned that since the monastery has been established, the water that they have in the stream is much better. The quality is better because of all the trees that have grown up in the monastery. We're fortunate that the soil is very hard, and so it keeps water very well. And so just like we have to find a place to store our wealth when we make money, and so we also have the fortune of having the nature here which is able to store the water. So if we contemplate nature in this way, it's able to teach us. But things are going the other direction most of the time in the world nowadays, that humans are destroying nature. There's deforestation that's going on all over the world, which is increasing the temperature of the world. And in Australia, recently, it's been very hot. And the sun is very strong over there. So there's over 100,000 people who get skin cancer. There's many, many people. And when I was over in Australia, I noticed this, that the sun was very strong. And there was one person I went to talk to who was wearing a large hat to protect him from the sun. It's very common over there. So many people get cancer because of the strength of the sun. We're fortunate here in Thailand that the sun isn't too strong, that we have quite a good environment and situation. There's not many natural disasters that happen. And perhaps there are floods that occur every now and then, but in each place it may be 10 years between the flooding. So it shows that this is a country that has a lot of merit and a lot of good fortune that's been accumulated from the goodness, the good actions of the people here. And things are very complete and full. So just as when it rains, that turns the land fresh and green, and when people look at this landscape, then the hearts in turn grow fresh. And so to our hearts, they experience this freshness. They become uplifted through the goodness that we create, through the generosity, through our sacrifice. And this is all a means of creating merit, which give rise to this inner refreshment. So sometimes people have a lot of wealth, a lot of money, but they don't have much knowledge. And so they don't use that wealth in a good way. They don't share it out very much. And so even though they have a lot externally, their hearts feel very dry. They may be very stressed. Or for other people, they may have a very high rank or position in their jobs or in society. But this means oftentimes that they don't have much time, so they don't get enough rest. So their bodies and their hearts feel very exhausted, and sickness may arise. They don't have the time to feed themselves well, to do much exercise. So we do need this for our bodies. They need good food. They need to be moved about, to be exercised. And likewise with our hearts, we do need to train them as well. So the chanting that we do, this brings up an inner refreshment of the heart. And when we gain samadhi, this can help us greatly. The joy arises in our hearts through that. And as we develop this collectedness and firmness of mind, it makes our hearts very bright. It's even more so when we gain vipassana or insight. This really brightens up, it turns up the light in our hearts. We also need to teach ourselves a sense of what's just enough, what's just right. We need to understand this, to have a sense of contentment here in the present moment with the things that we have. And this brings up a lot of happiness for us. So there was one doctor who was taking care of two patients. And both of these patients had been in an accident. And both of them were crippled due to the accident. And they were the same age in the same situation. But one was suffering a lot because there was this aversion to their disability. They didn't want to be confined to a wheelchair like they were. But the other person was very happy and grateful because they were still alive. They didn't die in the accident. They had their body, and they could use this to create more goodness and merit in their lives. So really, the happiness or the suffering that we experience depends on our minds and on the views that we have. And if we have right view, this will lead us to happiness. Some people, when they see others offering food to monks in the morning, they feel very happy. They look at this and they give their anumodana. But for others, they look at people offering food on alms round and they feel very aggravated inside. And they think, well, why do people have to do this? Why do they go to the monastery? Why do people take the precepts like this? And they don't have much faith in their hearts. And their hearts become very upset due to these things. So that's possible for some people to see other people create goodness and for them to suffer because of that. This then makes them very stressed and they can even develop physical illnesses because of it. But if we have a heart that rejoices in the goodness of others, then it will bring us ease internally. So at the time of the Buddha, there was one man who would announce when the lunar observance day came about. He would go around announcing this to people and suggesting for other people to make merit on this day. And then they would. And many people would sometimes forget that it was the Wat Marp, the lunar observance day. But on hearing this, they would go and give charity and take up the precepts, and they would receive merit. So this was a very intelligent act of his to announce to others that it was the lunar observance day. So for those people who are intelligent, then we'll use the opportunity to create merit. And it often shows that if people were born at the time of the Buddha, that they had this merit. But there were also those who were very unfortunate, who didn't have all that much merit, who were born at the time of the Buddha. There were those who argued with the Buddha, who were very angry with him. So even though they did have some degree of goodness that allowed them to meet the Buddha. They didn't use that well. So now we have a similar situation in a way, that there can be this person who comes around and announces to us that it's the lunar observance day. But rather than them doing it in person, now people do it over line or WhatsApp. So there are many devas around these days who are reminding us that it's the lunar observance day, reminding us to make merit. So for those people who have meritorious hearts, they use that and they act out of that through these apps that we have these days, through WhatsApp or Line. And so they can create merit through this means. But it's also the same the other way around. And for those people who have quite a lot of unwholesome states in their minds, that flows out through this new technology as well. So some people, they can be quite intelligent in the way that they make merit. That even though they may not have a lot of money, still they just give a little bit every day. Maybe they go to the monastery and just give 5 baht or 10 baht and give this in an offering to for the use of water or electricity in the monastery. But mostly they do it consistently like this to bring up happiness and joy in their hearts every day. The opposite is also true, that sometimes people have a lot of wealth, but they hold on to all of it, and that can create quite a lot of difficulty, become a burden on them. And so we need to know a sense of just what's right. And that when we have wealth, when we gain it, then we keep some. And we also know to share some of it out as well. But we shouldn't also spend too much either. So we don't keep it all, but we also don't spend the whole lot. Because there are some people who they may gain 5 million, 10 million, 20 million baht, but just over the course of a weekend they can spend the whole lot. And they think to themselves that if they go out and enjoy themselves like this, then they'll feel very at ease, but it brings them difficulty later on. So I give my anumodana to everyone who has come on this day, that even though it's raining, you still come out to offer food. And I try to keep up this practice, and even though it rains, and to still go on alms round. And before I went to the monastery of Luang Kamdi, and even though he was 61 years old, he would still go on alms round in the rain. He'd take an umbrella with him and walk out on alms round. And Luang Cha would practice like this as well. It would have to be raining very, very hard for him to not go on alms round. So we took care of the practices and the duties of a monk in this way. And so the Buddha taught us like this, for the monks, that no matter how much we gain, we shouldn't throw away or forget this practice of alms round. We shouldn't forget the practice of staying at the foot of a tree or for using a rag robe. And for myself, I took up this last practice because I saw the great benefits that it had. When I was 5 years as a monk, I got a cloth that had been wrapped around a corpse. And the smell of the pus that was had stained that cloth still stayed on it for 2 years. And I would hang that robe, this lower robe that I made from that piece of cloth, in front of my kuti. And then when I walked back to my kuti, I would see the robe hanging there, and it would immediately remind me of the fact of death. That this recollection of death would come up very easily. And some people ask, well, did I enjoy wearing that? Well, I didn't. But it was a practice, one of these ascetic practices that the Buddha had laid down. And I figured that if the Buddha taught it, then it must have benefit. And so it's something that I would do. And there's also this practice or one of the medicines that the Buddha recommended was that of taking medicinal fruits that have been pickled in cow's urine. And it really smells very, very bad. And there's one time that I had it, one of these small medicinal fruits, what they call samal in Thai. And it had been pickled in cow's urine, and the smell still stuck to my tongue 15 days afterwards. It was so pungent. But it's a medicine that the Buddha recommended. So we should try to practice following the teachings of the Buddha. And because the Buddha taught it, it will give us great benefits. Just like the establishment of this monastery of Wat Marp Jan that came about through the practice of alms round. That when I was staying close by to the village, the Marp Jan village, when I was wandering, I went on alms round, and one of the lay people that I met, they took me to this land. There was a night prior to that a woman, she had a dream. She saw two monks wandering. And then she also saw Luang Man as well. And he came knocking on her door. And Luang Man gave her 2 amulets. But this woman, she'd never actually seen Luang Man before, so she didn't know who this monk was. So the next day she went to Tan Po Phuong's monastery, who was a disciple of Luang Man. And so she went there and she saw Luang Man's picture in the hall. And she asked who that monk was, and she was told it was Luang Man. And the next morning, I went out on alms round, and I happened to meet this woman's son. And so he told her mother about this, and they took me here to this land. So really the establishment of this monastery came about through this practice of alms round. And it's very similar to what happened in England, the first branch monastery of Luang Pu Cha's that was established overseas. And it's the monks there were going on alms round in London, and they met a layman who eventually ended up offering them the land on Chidhurst, in the forest there. And so it is possible for monks to go out on alms round in other countries. Initially there was worry about whether this would be feasible or not, that probably people would think they were just beggars and maybe the police would chase them away. But Luang Pu Cha said for them not to worry about it, that we're following the Buddha, so there's no need to have any anxiety. So when Luang Pu Cha went over to England the first time, he went on alms round, and policemen actually came up to ask them what they were doing. And he was able to explain that they weren't begging, that they were just following a practice that the Buddha has taught. And eventually they came to accept this. And so now it's quite normal overseas for monks to go on alms round. It's possible. And what Luang Pu Cha did in England was the first example of this. There was also another time when Luang Pu Cha was invited to a meal at the palace by the former king of Thailand. And he took his alms bowl with him. And there was another monk who was invited to this meal as well. And he walked up to Luang Pu Cha and said, well, why are you bringing your alms bowl with you? Aren't you shy of the king? And so Luang Pu Cha asked this monk back, well, why don't you have your alms bowl? Aren't you shy of the Buddha? So Luang Pu Cha, he really taught this to look after these practices and the duties that the monks have, to really take care of this path of practice. So I give my anumodana to everyone who's come to the monastery to create goodness on this day.